All right, in case you didn't get just enough practice there. Hallelujah, Christ is risen. Now, according to the Gospel of Mark, that phrase, or anything remotely like it, was not uttered on that first Easter Sunday. As you heard me read just a few minutes ago, Mark records the discovery of the empty tomb rather differently than the other Gospel writers do. There is, in his story, no joy or excitement. There's not even any real curiosity about what has happened. What we have instead is a story of fear and confusion. The women who have come to prepare the body flee from the empty tomb, and they say nothing to anyone. This makes for a somewhat anticlimactic Easter story, wouldn't you say? And I really didn't want to preach on it. In fact, I was going to swap in the more familiar text from John's Gospel, John chapter 20. But then, as I was putting the bulletins together, I read this little introduction that we have. This year may be the one in which John's resurrection account is likely to be chosen over Mark's. Perhaps because Mark's Gospel ends so abruptly with astonishment and fear instead of joyful proclamation. Yes, that's exactly why I was going to do it. Yet Mark may speak to our experience more directly than the other Gospels. Corinthians and Acts fill out the story by telling of appearances of the risen Christ. Peter says, "We ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. And so do we in a foretaste of the mountaintop feast where death will be no more." Gee, thanks, Bulletin. You just shamed me into preaching the text I didn't want to. But you know, I had a thought occur to me after reading that introduction and reading through the Gospel from Mark. The women run away from the tomb. They say nothing to anyone about what they have seen. They are consumed with fear and uncertainty. There is no hallelujah, no celebration, no triumph, except that there is. The tomb is empty. Christ has risen. It all still happens, whether the people get it or not. Last Sunday, those of you who are here for our Palm Sunday worship heard me speak at length about what Jesus meant when he told the Pharisees that if the crowd on that first Palm Sunday were silent, then the very rocks would cry out. If I had wanted to follow up that lesson this week, I could not have picked a more perfect Easter story than the one that Mark gives us. The women fail. They run away. They ignore the instruction of the angel. They are scared and they say nothing. And because they are silent, a stone speaks. Not with words, but by rolling away from the door of the tomb. It moves because it must. For within that tomb is one who will not remain there any longer. Within that tomb is hope. Within is salvation. Within is the redemption of the world. And all that will remain contained no longer. The women did not understand. But it happened anyway. That's the kind of story that Mark tells throughout the whole of his gospel. You know, the disciples never get it. I was telling my colleagues earlier this week when we had met to discuss the sermon lessons that it seems like in Mark that those who knew him best knew him least. The disciples simply don't understand most of the time. And yet, despite that, things still happen the way they were meant to anyway. Jesus is still born. Jesus still lives. Jesus still goes to the cross. Jesus still dies. And Jesus still rises again. It is not about us. We are the recipients of God's plan of salvation, but that plan is not dependent upon us. It is not dependent upon our knowledge. It is not dependent upon our strength. It is not dependent upon our rightness. It's not dependent on our morality or anything else that has to do with us. And it's a good thing, too, because we'd make a mess of it. And if you don't believe me, there's actually a bit of a funny moment in the way Mark tells the story. I don't know if you caught it, but I think it highlights precisely why God cannot depend upon human aid in his plan. The women have diligently gathered up all their spices, their oils, everything they need to prepare Jesus' body. They awaken early, and they are ready to go to the tomb to do what they must. And they have done all of this work, all of this preparation, and yet only after they have set out does it occur to them, oh yeah, we've got to deal with that stone. For those of you who are somewhat familiar with internet memes, this is what we call a facepalm moment. It's very much so like someone doing this. You know, I can't find my sermon manuscript. Where'd it go? Oh, there it is. Or the ever popular, you know, where'd my glasses go? You know, none of us have ever done anything like that, have we? It's such a human moment. So innocently stupid. But our lives are full of moments like that, are they not? We are often used to thinking of sin as something malicious. But it isn't always. Sometimes even when we are at our best, when our hearts are as pure as these women's unquestionably are, there is still room for human ineptitude to creep in. We'll mess it up, even when we're doing everything in our power not to. God's plan for salvation cannot depend upon such unreliable aid, and it does not. It relies instead on the one who is perfect, who obeys the Father with complete obedience, who goes willingly to the cross for the sake of the whole world. It's about Jesus, and it's about him alone. Sometimes for us that's a hard thing to swallow. Our own egos and our own sense of self-importance keep trying to interject ourselves into it. But if we step back for a moment, we see God's wisdom in this. Try as we might to save ourselves, we soon realize just how impossible that really is. We'll mess it up somehow. We'll cave in at some point to our nastier, baser selves. Or if we don't do that, then we'll just have one moment where we're just plain dumb. God knows I've been guilty of both more times than I can count. There have certainly been moments where I've been mean and nasty. God forgive me for those. But there have been just as many, if not more, where I've proceeded to open my mouth without promptly sticking my foot within it, speaking without engaging my brain, or acting without engaging my brain, and doing something that's just incredibly stupid. I don't want it to be about me, because those things will then get in the way. I'll screw it up. I'll be a lot like the women on that morning. I'd come to the empty tomb and I'd hear the angel tell me the truth about what has happened. And like them, I would probably still run away in fear. I'd mess up just like they did. I wouldn't understand. I wouldn't get it. Honestly, I mean, here I live 2,000 years later, and there are still moments when I don't get it. And I have a feeling I'm not alone. I have a feeling there's a lot of people in this room who are just like that. But it's not about me. It's not about you. It's not dependent upon us. It's dependent upon Jesus. And he went to the cross, never wavering from that path. He went and he died, and on the third day he rose again. He is risen. And whether I or anyone else proclaims it or not, it still happened. Salvation was still won. The promise was still fulfilled. The world has still been redeemed. It has all happened as God meant it to happen. Whether we get it or understand it or believe it or not. It was meant to be. God's will be done. And thus, Christ is risen. Amen.